Breaking news, Russia has now formally declared it is no longer bound by its self-imposed moratorium on the deployment of short and intermediate-range nuclear missiles, signaling an era of a new reality that all its opponents will have to reckon with. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine a world where diplomatic restraint dissolves overnight and nuclear politics shifts into overdrive. That is exactly what has happened. Moscow's foreign ministry has announced that because the U.S. and NATO have begun deploying previously banned missile systems in Europe and the Asia-Pacific, such as Tomahawk-capable launchers in the Philippines and hypersonic systems in Australia, the preconditions for Russia's unilateral restraint no longer exist. On this basis, Moscow says it will take military, technical, measures to re-establish what it calls strategic balance. This escalatory turn was explicitly voiced by former President Dmitry Medvedev, now deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, in strong terms. The Russian Foreign Ministry's statement on the withdrawal of the moratorium is the result of NATO countries' anti-Russian policy. This is a new reality all our opponents will have to reckon with. Expect further steps. Medvedev's message came shortly after an exchange of nuclear rhetoric with U.S. former President Donald Trump, who responded by ordering two U.S. nuclear submarines to move closer to Russian territorial waters. In turn, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov underscored that Moscow remains very careful when dealing with nuclear issues, reaffirming that Russia maintains a responsible position, and that formal foreign policy remains directed by President Vladimir Putin himself. But what does this mean on the ground? Putin remains firm in his posture, while expressing openness to technical talks and even a meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky. He insists on rigid terms, such as Ukraine abandoning NATO ambitions and relinquishing territories currently under Russian control, which Kiev rejects outright. Moscow is also ramping up production of new hypersonic missile systems and deploying tactical nuclear assets in Belarus, explicitly warning that its entire nuclear doctrine remains fully operational. Medvedev, once viewed as more moderate during his presidency, has since reinvented himself as a hawkish voice. Analysts note that since 2022, he has escalated his rhetoric, threatening nuclear strikes on Western capitals, predicting Ukraine's collapse, even floating territorial revisionism in Eastern Europe, reflecting a conscious image shift to appeal to the nationalist base and secure his position within Russia's power elite. Meanwhile, President Putin's approach remains carefully calibrated. While publicly diplomatic and open to dialogue, he continues to frame Russia's war in Ukraine as justified, rejecting foreign pressure and insisting that Russia will not retreat. Kremlin messaging emphasizes strategic caution, but determination to safeguard what it defines as national interests, even amid global alarm at rising tensions from the U.S. side. Trump's rapid redeployment of submarines and hardline statements underscore a clear willingness to challenge Russian assertiveness. He has set an August 8 deadline for Russia to agree to a ceasefire, with economic sanctions on the table for noncompliance. He also warned of secondary sanctions against trading partners like China or India, effectively ratcheting up pressure on Moscow indirectly. Washington continues diplomatic outreach via envoy Steve Witkoff, expected in Moscow, but time is tight and options are narrowing. In summary, Russia's withdrawal from the missile deployment moratorium marks a marked escalation in the international strategic drama. Medvedev's hardline language, Putin's firm positioning, NATO deployments, U.S. submarine moves and sanctions threats all create a fast-moving crisis. The risk of miscalculation looms large, especially as nuclear signaling becomes part of the public narrative. Yet, in the midst of global tension, it's worth remembering, the world has navigated dire crises before. Diplomatic channels still exist, and history shows that dialogue, even under fire, and eventually prevail. If each side recognizes the stakes and the shared imperative of avoiding catastrophe, restraint may yet return. To our viewers tuning in and reading every word, this is not just news, it's a turning point in global security. Stay engaged, stay informed. The decisions made now shape the world we leave to future generations. If you found this breakdown insightful, consider subscribing. My daily coverage brings clarity to global flashpoints, empowering you with knowledge and perspective. Russia has officially abandoned its self-imposed moratorium on deploying short and intermediate-range nuclear-capable missiles, marking a major escalation in global strategic dynamics. Imagine logging on one morning only to learn the rules of nuclear deterrence have shifted forever. Russia's foreign ministry announced on August 4, 2025, that it no longer considers itself bound by its 5-year unilateral ban on land-based missiles with ranges between 500 and 500 km ground-launched systems previously restricted under the INF Treaty. Moscow cited U.S. and NATO deployments of Tomahawk-capable Typhoon launchers in the Philippines, Dark Eagle hypersonic systems in Australia, and planned missile deployments in Europe as direct threats to its national security. Russia declared this action necessary to restore what it calls strategic balance. Facing this backdrop, former President Dmitry Medvedev, now deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, took to social media to blame NATO's anti-Russian policy for ending the moratorium and warned opponents to expect further steps. In what he described as a new geopolitical reality all rivals must reckon with, Kremlin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov emphasized that while nuclear rhetoric should be handled with caution, official policy decisions remain under President Vladimir Putin's authority. President Putin himself has maintained a calibrated stance. He affirmed Russia's strategic posture remains unchanged and outlined readiness for peace talks under strict conditions, such as Ukraine abandoning NATO aspirations and relinquishing territories under Russian control. Russia continues to produce hypersonic systems like the Orshnik, which Putin announced has entered service and is slated for deployment in Belarus before year-end. Putin described it as a weapons system capable of Mach 10 speeds with both nuclear and conventional payloads, capable of striking much of Europe with high difficulty of interception. On the opponent's side, NATO leadership and allied capitals swiftly condemned Russia's move. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg reaffirmed that Russia alone bears responsibility for the INF Treaty's demise, stressed that NATO will not mirror Russia by deploying land-based nuclear missiles in Europe, and promised a measured response to maintain credible deterrence without escalating into an arms race. NATO's Hague summit reaffirmed an ironclad commitment to Article 5 collective defense and new defense spending targets aimed at deterring Russian aggression. Western governments also condemned a recent Russian missile strike on Kiev that killed 31 people, including 5 children. Ukrainian President Zelensky called it a deliberate terror campaign. EU and UK leaders demanded new sanctions and urgent ceasefire measures, placing full blame on Moscow for intensifying civilian suffering. Former U.S. President Donald Trump responded with military signaling. He ordered 2 U.S. nuclear submarines repositioned to strategic regions in response to Medvedev's nuclear rhetoric, calling the language foolish and inflammatory. Trump also issued a ceasefire ultimatum. Russia had until August 8 to agree to halt hostilities or face new sanctions targeting its oil exports and trade partners such as China and India. Ukrainian officials urged direct talks between Zelensky and Putin, though many are skeptical of real progress. Western envoys, including Steve Witkoff expected in Moscow, may represent last ditch diplomatic openings before the deadline passes. Still, Ukraine's confidence in potential breakthrough remains low, even as military and civilian pressure mounts at home. Meanwhile, analysts warn Russia may soon exit even further nuclear arms control frameworks beyond the INF structure. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has signaled plans to abandon more limiting treaties, framing them as obsolete in today's high-tension environment. Security think tanks argue Russia is rewriting the narrative to portray itself as restrained while portraying the West as belligerent provocateurs on the Ukrainian front. Reports emerged that Kiev's intelligence claimed to have breached Russia's naval systems to steal classified schematics for its latest Bore, a class submarine, potentially undercutting confidence in Russia's strategic deterrent capability. In sum, Moscow's decision to abandon its missile moratorium has escalated tensions dangerously. Medvedev's public hawkishness, Putin's military-industrial buildup, NATO's defensive posture, Trump's submarine deployment and sanctions threats, Ukraine's appeals for direct talks, all converge in a high-stakes standoff that could redefine global security norms. Yet, in this era of confrontation and brinkmanship, there remains room for restraint through diplomacy. Past crises have shown that even when brinkmanship peaks, backchannels and strategic dialogue can still avert catastrophe. If all parties heed the gravity of potential escalation and uphold the imperative of de-escalation, a path towards stabilization is still possible. To our viewers reading this and watching our coverage, this isn't mere reporting. It's a call to stay engaged, alert, informed. The decisions being made today will define tomorrow's world. If you found this deep dive illuminating, hit subscribe and join our community. Your support empowers us to bring you context, clarity, and comprehensive analysis every single day. Let's stay vigilant, informed, and committed to a more secure future together.